All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiana Nurse. I'm the Senior Program Officer of IDEA Programs, which is a very new unit at ACLS, which stands for Intentional Design for an Equitable Academy. I'm joined by my colleague, Katie Rice, who's the Program Associate of IDEA Programs, and she'll be managing the tech behind the scenes. As the program lead for the Digital Justice Grant Program, which is now entering its third competition year, I'm very happy to be with all of you this afternoon to discuss some of the big picture aspects of the program, its core mission and values, as well as some of the nitty-gritty details such as the application components and eligibility requirements. But in that work, I'm also eager to share the ways that this program continues to morph and evolve, primarily motivated by the generous feedback we receive from our primary constituency, you all. So, in that spirit, I'll also highlight not only some substantial changes to this year's application, but also explain the rationale and the aspirational vision behind them. As always, this session will be recorded so that those with scheduling conflicts, or if you have other members of your project team, you can still share these materials with them. So as I mentioned, today's session encompasses a mix of discussion, both about the ethos of the ACLS Digital Justice Grants Program, but also I want to explain some of the finer details of this year's competition. After defining the vision for it by highlighting how and why the program is designed in the way that it is, as well as uplifting some of the currently funded projects, I'll then explain some key details about eligibility, particularly the difference between seed and development grants. I'll then give an overview of the application components, which have been restructured for this year's competition, highlight some dates on the competition timeline, and then leave some time at the end for Q&A. So given the volume of participants today, we'll use the Zoom's Q&A feature, which my colleague Katie will be monitoring. Please post your questions there throughout the session and be sure to upvote the questions that you would like to see answered. Obviously, we won't have time to get to everyone's individual inquiries, but I do hope that I can answer some questions that people might have in common. I would also encourage you to try to frame your questions as generally as possible. If you have very specific concerns about your individual project, I'll explain how best to get in touch with us in order to receive some feedback towards the end of the session. So let's begin with the program parameters and ethos of the Digital Justice Grants Program. It's important to start here because I want to underscore the specificity of what this name, digital justice, means at ACLS and within the context of this program. Now, this isn't so much an exhaustive definitional effort. I'm not defining the incredibly complicated and multifaceted term digital justice or, talking about how that term is used in other spaces, but rather I really want to make plain why we mobilize the aspirational and reparative spirit of justice in the very name of this program so that you have a better sense of whether or not your project would be a good fit for it. When we invoke the term digital justice, again, within the context of this program, we're referring to an intentional grant-making design process meant to support digital projects in the humanities and interpretive social sciences that critically engage with the histories and interests of people of color and other marginalized groups through the ethical and intentional use of digital tools and methods. So you'll notice in that framing we position digital justice as both a process and an outcome with a specific thematic and methodological focus. And while the general contours of that process are, in fact, applied to our other programs in the IDEA unit, its application here aspires to be attuned to the specific needs and challenges that go with supporting historically underfunded topics of study, doubly so when they are made digital. Here's a very quick visual that captures how we understand the four modes of iterative and interlinked activities that constitute that intentional design process. But what do these activities look like concretely within the context of the Digital Justice Grants Program? So the first is, of course, the recognition of context and its historicity. We begin by asking the question, how did we get here? Why are there certain realms within the field of digital scholarship that can more readily access funding over others? And that's mostly a rhetorical question. We know the answers to those questions and why the landscape is uneven. We grapple with the histories, the ongoing histories and legacies of settler colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy every day in the ways that it manifests in our institutions. And so our current, educational landscape was never designed to support Black studies or trans studies. And those very inequities in funding and institutional prioritization and investment have mapped themselves onto the digital sphere. And it's that very context that drives the subsequent decisions about how the Digital Justice Grant Program is designed and administered. So we get to the intentionality of resource design. For example, the very structure of the program, in this case, the bifurcation between seed and development grants is intended to further redistribute the privilege of experimentation and risk taking to those who have had to do that work with far fewer resources. Innovation and advancements in scholarly fields, especially for digital projects, happen precisely through that kind of experimentation and risk taking, two activities that are fundamental, even if not properly recognized, within the demands for the return on investment that is so present within the genre of grant writing. You can see the intentionality behind research design as well in our webinar series. They're curated based on feedback from reviewers about areas where they see the applicant pool needing more coaching, and also from applicants who have expressed a desire for more advising on specific components of their application. I'll talk a little bit about the webinar series later in this session, but I wanted to flag the reasoning behind the why we picked the specific topics early on. We then move to redistributive methods, which is a relatively sort of new priority that we've tried to build into the Digital Justice Grant Program. And that's reflected in the thread of capacity building, which we introduced last year. And so the prompts around capacity building are really geared towards um, allowing applicants to give a more granular understanding of the context in which they pursue their work so that reviewers can select awardees based on where the funds might do the most good, insofar as bolstering the creation of digital scholarship. And so I want to be clear with that, though, because we don't expect applicants to articulate how their projects will solve all the problems at their respective institutions. When we ask them to talk about capacity building, we want to be really attentive and mindful of scale here. But it is our hope that those prompts can give our reviewers a more granular understanding of the context within which applicants pursue their work so that they can better funnel resources where they have the potential to do the most good. And so as we think about the redistributive methods, we obviously want them to be geared toward reparative outcomes, right? And I want to say too that these are always aspirational and they're always grounded in answering the question, how can we support and fund restorative, reparative, and sustainable experimentation with technology that opens avenues for more transformative relationships to the past, present, and future? Right. So as we think about these four modes of activity, again, that constitute the process, the intentional grant making process that has gone on to make the Digital Justice Grant Program what it is, I wanted to flag that as sort of the ethos as to why we sort of administer it in the way that we do as well. So now that I've spoken a little bit about the big picture vision and intention of the program, I'll transition into reviewing some of the concrete details of the competition and application that might be helpful to you as you craft your materials. So the first detail is, of course, determining if your project is eligible for consideration. So the first eligibility requirement is that the principal investigator must be a scholar in the humanities. During the pilot year, which is now 2 years ago, we received a lot of inquiries about what this meant, particularly whether or not we were limiting our definition of scholar to those with PhDs or faculty positions. We're not. We still aren't for this competition. Given the very collaborative nature of digital work, especially the extent to which librarians are often at the center of some of these projects, and the ways in which graduate students partner with faculty members, I want to make clear that our definition of a scholar for this program is one with a demonstrated track record of engagement in scholarly debates and communities, whether they be by publications, conference presentations, or collaborations with other scholars, both in and outside of their fields. It is not limited to a professional title or a credential. The second eligibility requirement is about the extent to which project teams agree to make their content publicly accessible. Now, this used to be in the form of the intellectual property agreement, which was an application component. We have since folded this into the eligibility requirements in order to pare down what the application packets look like for our reviewers. But I also want to flag a key phrase here, which is that the project teams agree to the most liberal open source and Creative Commons license that is appropriate for the underlying content. So that little bit that's italicized. We're in the process of developing much more culturally sensitive and updated guidelines here, ones that take into account that not all materials can or should be made widely accessible, especially when they belong to communities who have historically been subject to plunder and are currently subject to various kinds of harassment, both online and off. For now, however, we're deferring to project teams and encouraging them to articulate to us in their dissemination plans how people will be able to access their content. And this is also a sort of point of negotiation and further reflection once folks receive awards. We're very much open to thinking through what more specific IP agreements look like, depending on what the underlying content of the project looks like. So the final eligibility requirement is that an institution of higher education in the US must administer the awarded grant funds. In the pilot year, again, we required that these institutions needed to host proposed projects. That was the language that we used. But it's not actually the case that we require your institutions to provide like the servers on which your content lives. You may certainly use those if you have easy access to them at your institution, but digital ownership doesn't need to belong to your institution, at least not on our end. We've since changed the language here to reflect more of a financial relationship around managing the actual grant funds. And so if you're not formally affiliated with an institution, I recommend partnering with someone who is. And in any case, the strongest applications always feature a project team rather than individual scholars. I said this last year. I will say it this year. Hopefully, I won't have to say it next year because this will be, we'll have gotten some substantial progress on this. But I do want to flag that this stipulation is something we are actively working towards changing. ACLS does have a precedent of distributing award funds directly to scholars through our central fellowship. And I've discussed with my colleagues what kinds of financial processes we already have in place that would give us more flexibility with funding distribution models, and that would also grant more agency to grantees in terms of how they're able to expend their grant funds. And so there is some complexity that comes with distributing funds to project teams versus individual scholars in the forms of fellowships that we're still working through. But again, it's still very much on our radar, even though it is a very, very complicated issue that seems simple on the surface. The three eligibility requirements that I just described apply to both seed and development grants, but there is one requirement between the two that varies, and that's about assessing what phase of development your project is in. Seed grants, as the name implies, are for startup projects that are in the prototyping or proof of concept phase. And by contrast, development grants must demonstrate evidence of significant preliminary work, as well as a record of engagement with public or scholarly audiences. We often get the question of, well, what counts as a digital justice project? Again, what do you mean by that? And the short answer to that is that when we think of digital justice at ACLS, again, reiterating the sort of main heart of the project of this grant, we're really thinking about humanities, interpretive social sciences, projects that critically engage with the interests and histories of people of color and other marginalized groups through the ethical and intentional use of digital tools and methods. I might have to say that phrase again at the end of this webinar, just because I want to keep getting it into folks' head that these are the kinds of projects that this grant funds. So not only is there a specific thematic focus in terms of centering the histories of people of color, but also there is a methodological focus too in terms of the ethical and intentional use of digital tools and methods. And so in flagging that second part about the tools and methods, if you'll go on the website, all ACLS digital justice projects feature, in my opinion, a very profound and intentional relationship between form and content. It's usually very clear how the tools and methods inform both the project's intellectual contributions and its advancement of equity and justice. And so again, I think, or I hope that it's helpful to go through some examples of the digital projects we funded through this program so that you get a clearer sense thematically and methodologically of what a digital justice project looks like. And again, thinking through that difference between seed and development projects. So the first example of a project that received a seed grant this year is the Trans Games Digital Zine project led by professors R.A. Gass at Drexel and Teddy Pozo at Occidental College. Bringing together the work of transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, and gender non-conforming game developers, scholars, and gamers, this web-based publication will share interdisciplinary scholarship and public humanities work on and about the ways that trans game designers and communities of play have always shaped and continue to fundamentally shape this thriving entertainment industry. So here I'm sort of pulling from the abstract that you can read on our webpage. But I want to say that in terms of why this is a great example of a seed project is that the seed funding here will be used to develop and prototype this digital publication, which will be developed through a co-creative process with the trans creators that are at the center of the project. And so while this team already did some preliminary work in terms of identifying which partners they would work with, the proposed activities that ultimately got funded were for the piloting of a new publication platform. The next project is the Sounding Data Justice for Environmental Liberation in Southeast Queens, which is a collaboration between faculty members at CUNY York College, the City University of New York, York College, and the nonprofit, the Eastern Queens Alliance. So this project is an art science initiative that transforms data into sound to develop new ways of sharing air quality and aircraft noise data that the EQA, the Eastern Queen Alliance, already collects. The ultimate goal of the project, which is community run yet university based, how they described it, is to grow data literacy and foster environmental equity through liberation science and ecological art. Just as in the previous project, the partnerships between the faculty and community partners were already in place when the teams applied, but the funded activities are really oriented towards exploring a new method. So in this case, the data sonification is the new experimental method that that will be tested through the project, particularly with respect to how sonification, as opposed to the more familiar visualization, might be a better avenue for facilitating data sharing by community organizations with outsiders for advocacy purposes. So again, the two examples of seed grants that I presented already had existing partnerships with community members outside of their institutions, but there were new methods or new platforms that the teams wanted to experiment with and pilot, and that's sort of what the activities that they proposed were funded for. So if we move on to the development grants, which is again for established projects, the first example that I want to uplift is the Freedom and Captivity Archive project, which is a collaborative project between Colby College, the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, and the Maine Historical Society. Since 2020, The larger Freedom and Captivity Initiative has curated and facilitated community conversations in Maine that envision alternatives to incarceration while centering those with with the most direct experience with the carceral system. So previous activities before this project, which began in 2020, included 15 art exhibitions in galleries throughout the state of Maine, an online exhibition, and a podcast series, among some other activities. So these were things that sort of supported the project or defined the project well before this project applied for a development grant. So they were a well-established project when they applied. For their Digital Justice Development Grant, they will be extending this project to build out a publicly accessible digital archive of the experiences, insights, knowledges, and hidden stories of Maine's incarcerated and formerly incarcerated community members, which will then form the basis for community storytelling events throughout the coming year. The last example of a development grantee is the Personal Rights to Political, securely rendering Black lives legible through the application of advanced machine learning to anti-apartheid solidarity letters. This team is a transnational team that stretches from Kentucky, Washington, D.C., and Cape Town, South Africa. I'm sorry about that. And so I really wanted to highlight this example because this team actually won a Digital Justice Seed grant back in 2022. And through that work, the team used machine learning models to identify relationships, recognize handwriting, and redact sensitive information from about 700 letters written by family members of imprisoned anti-apartheid activists. And so the seed funding really helped them sort of think through what this new tool that they were developing would look like. Now that the team has won the development grant, they'll use those funds to implement solutions based on the project's first phase and hold training sessions at the Mayabuye Center Archive in South Africa, and that is the collection's home archive in Cape Town. Now that I've spoken a little bit about the big picture of the program and discussed the differences between the seed and development grants, I'll transition into reviewing the application components, which feature some important changes from last year's competition. So both the seed and development grants have the same application components, which include elements such as the bibliography, project timeline, budget and budget description, staffing, and institutional verification. Those things haven't changed. There are some key differences, though, between last year's application and this one's, which I've coded here in orange. So for those of you who applied last year or the year before that, you may remember the 7 to 10 page proposal narrative that comprised the bulk of the application. That's really where you got to describe what your project was about, what kind of tools you planned on using. If you're applying for a development grant, that's also the space where you talked about your project history, et cetera. For this year, we've replaced that model of the proposal narrative with a series of discrete prompts with a word count limit rather than page count limits. And so there's a few reasons why we shifted to this structure. For starters, this past spring, our reviewers offered some really critical feedback about the structure of the application and about the kind of information that they want to be able to more readily access as they go through an application. The most significant insight they offered was that applicants often spent way too much time within the proposal narrative talking about the intellectual underpinnings of the project, how it engages with certain subfields, certain bodies of literature, and they didn't spend nearly enough time talking about the project's mechanics. So its tools, its methods, how you are going to sort of do the work that you're proposing. Interestingly, we also heard a similar concern from applicants during our digital justice focus groups, which we hosted this past summer. During those sessions, applicants very generously shared their experiences navigating the competition and offered some really helpful suggestions around how we might change the structure of the application so that folks are better positioned to provide the information that reviewers actually want and need in order to advocate for their projects. So rather than sticking with the proposal narrative upload format, we've now shifted to this prompt-based model that asks very pointed questions about the different dimensions of your project. I believe there are 9 prompts for each of the applications. And again, because they are very clearly defined in terms of word count, this gives you a concrete sense of how much time, so to speak, you should be spending in terms of talking about the different dimensions of your project. So this, I hope, because this is the first year that we're trying this, will not only streamline the reading and evaluation process because similar types of information will be available in the same place across applications, but I also hope that it makes, completing your application a little bit more straightforward. The prompts with their word counts, as I said, give you a better sense of how much space to allot to different parts of your project. And also, you no longer have to guess, or better yet, simply know those unstated written rules about grant writing that dictate where you should put certain pieces of information about your project within a proposal, right? The sort of common knowledge, so to speak, around what the first paragraph has to look like or what the first page has to look like. This offers a very standardized format where each piece of information is going to be in the same place across applications. And so reviewers also won't have to go flipping through pages to find, that gem sentence that someone put on page 5 when they really should have put it on page 2 or something like that. I'd also like to take this opportunity, obviously, to thank the reviewers who offered their feedback and to thank the scholar or to thank the applicants who attended our focus groups to offer this feedback. But particularly, there's an independent and disabled scholar, Tikla Babka, who pointed out that the word counts actually make a significant difference instead of page counts, particularly for applicants who might have visual impairments who have to constantly adjust the formatting as they're drafting the narrative. And so the word counts actually help ameliorate some of those issues because you don't have to do a similar kind of switching back and forth between different formats. So we've taken all of those pieces of feedback and implemented them within this new structure. But again, since this is the first time that we are trying this, we will also be asking if folks would like to participate in our focus groups next summer. We're going to have them again in order to give some feedback about their experiences navigating it. Aside from the specific application components, I do want to uplift that we are continuing to exclude formal letters of recommendation from the application. None of the reviewers from last year's competition reported that their ability to evaluate applications was lessened because they didn't have them. This was a pointed question that we asked in the post-review survey. No one missed them. They did, however, recommend asking for brief statements of support from community partners if a project features them. Sorry. So that they wouldn't have to extrapolate the nature of those partnerships based on the materials. So that is an added component to be mindful of this year. If your project features extramural community partners, you'll need to have them provide a very brief, and by that I mean no more than 1-page double space letter of support that details the nature of the partnership. So the last thing I'd like to underscore with respect to the application itself is the institutional verification, which is not a formal letter of recommendation. It's a form that should take no more than 20 minutes to complete, which we note in the instructions that are sent to the administrators who will submit this on your behalf. The form asks administrators to confirm that the grant funds will be distributed through their institution, that any activities done for the grant can be counted for tenure and promotion, and that the grantees can use any available tech infrastructure at the institution for their projects. That's it. So it's confirming that those things are in place. And so lastly, in our ongoing efforts to provide more resources and how to apply for our grants and fellowships, prospective applicants can still access the supplementary materials that we made available last year, including the budget template, some sample application materials from the 2022 cohort of digital justice grantees, and also recordings of last year's webinars on data ethics and capacity building. So my colleague Katie is now going to post the link to those materials in the chat, but again, you can find them on the program page for the Digital Justice Grants program on the ACLS site. So the last topic today before we get into your questions is the competition timeline and to review some important dates that should be on your radar. The most obvious date is the deadline for applications, which is December 3rd, 2024 at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. After this date and time, our online fellowship application will no longer allow for submissions, and unfortunately, we cannot allow extensions of any kind. This date is also the deadline by which the administrators at your respective institutions should submit their institutional verification. It's for that reason that if you do decide to apply, I recommend you register in the application portal as soon as possible so that you can submit your administrator's email address and our portal will send them the instructions on how to submit the verification form. You don't have to complete your entire application in one sitting. You also don't have to complete all of the prompts in one sitting. But again, if you are going to apply, I recommend sending that email or inputting your administrator's information in as soon as possible, because as I'm sure you all know, folks are busy and so emails get lost and it might take more time than you anticipate for someone to submit that form on your behalf. So given the increased volume of applications we received in last year's competition, I believe there was about 140% increase in applications compared to the 2021-2022 competition. We've had to also restructure our review process and institute an additional round of review. So the results of that first round of review will be shared in February of 2025, followed by the results of the final round of review in April. And this is also my hope that as we're able to send out notifications sooner, we won't have folks who did not receive funding waiting for months at a time to get that decision. I also want to highlight the schedule for the Digital Justice Fall Webinar Series, since there is still time to register for those that are relevant for your project. So we developed this series along with curating the supplementary materials that you can find on the ACLS site as a way of making plain the hidden curriculum that goes into grant writing. This general information session was the first of 6, all of which will be recorded and posted online so that you can view it asynchronously or view it again if you attended in real time. The office hour sessions with ACLS staff, one in late October and another right before the deadline in late November, will primarily function as an opportunity to get more information about program parameters and to ask specific questions related to your project. The other 3 sessions, which feature invited interlocutors who have served as reviewers in former years for the Digital Justice Grant Program, are specific to topics that appear in the application prompts and have been curated specifically according to feedback we receive from former reviewers as well as from applicants about different areas they'd like more coaching on. On October 2nd, we're joined by Professor Rachel Kuhl from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as Tanciana Bryant at Barnard College, as they discuss best practices for articulating the how-to of your digital project. So thinking about digital justice in practice, what kinds of tools, methods, and deliverables sort of constitute the work of these projects, and also how best to talk about them in your application. A few weeks later, on October 17th, Charlotte Nunez at Lafayette College and Ricardo Punsalan at the University of Michigan will be joining us to discuss cultivating community partnership in digital projects. And so again, all with an eye to how to best capture and articulate the work that you've done with your community partners in your application materials. And our last webinar will feature Andre Bach and another interlocutor I'm still confirming with, as they discuss operationalizing your digital project with a specific eye to crafting budgets, timelines, and work plans. And this session specifically, again, was something that folks were really keen on in terms of thinking about some of these more practical, concrete elements of the project, of the proposal rather, that would be great to sort of talk shop with someone and get some feedback on. So just as we did last year, the format of the 90-minute sessions with our interlocutors will open with a 30-minute discussion about the topic. That will be recorded, followed by 40 to 50 minutes of breakout sessions where you can engage with them more directly and get some targeted feedback on your application. That part will not be recorded. I'm going to ask my colleague Katie to pop the link to register for those sessions in the chat, so you have it for your reference, and we hope to see you there. All right, so now that I have spoken for quite a long while about the general ethos of the Digital Justice Grant Program, why it's designed in the way that it is, how we try to administer it, some of its aspirational goals and visions, and then some of the concrete aspects of it relative to the application, some of the resources that we're offering, I now want to open up the floor to questions, and we'll spend the next 10 or 15 minutes answering some of these questions before we conclude. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and she'll read some of those questions, and I will answer them.
So one of the questions we received is, how does the administration of funds look like at the higher education institutions from ACLS's perspective? I ask because the school I work at takes 56% of the funds for administrative purposes. Should the budget include that?
So this grant does not support indirect costs at those institutions, and I have sort of engaged in conversations with grantees who actually really like that feature of this grant, because they're then able to say to their institution, actually, all of this money is for my project. You are able to build in monies toward salary allocations, because that supports that, we consider that a kind of direct costs for the labor that goes into supporting the project. But in terms of those kinds of admin fees that institutions take, this grant does not support that. So very happy to engage further over email if you need like a written declaration of that from ACLS to pass on to the folks at your institution. But again, this grant does not support indirect costs.
Okay, you mentioned that most successful grants are submitted by a team of individuals rather than a single person. Is it possible for an individual researcher to win a grant?
It is not impossible. I'm just speaking from what has historically been funded. And part of the reason I suspect why project teams are always more successful is because with digital projects, the levels of technical, intellectual expertise required to support the project will require a team. And so even if you submit a project where you are the sole PI on the project and sort of directing it, I would still expect or anticipate that project to engage consultants or other people that you're bringing in to help with some of the other aspects of the project. And so I think if you're framing it in that way, and that's reflective in the work plan and the budget, that you're bringing in other folks who have those different kinds, especially with technical expertise, then that's perfectly fine. I definitely don't want to discourage folks who are not working with a team to apply, just being very honest that, you know, as you can see for yourself, the projects that are funded tend to be collaboratory and team oriented.
Another question is, are community partners required?
No, they're not required. But again, given the nature of this grant program, which is digital justice, and in terms of projects that must sort of critically engage with those histories of marginalized populations, the spirit of the program sort of demands that you have a substantial engagement with those communities, right? And also, I think it's something that the reviewers who serve for this program really look for, right? So the ethos being nothing about us without us. And so again, it is not required for you to have a community partner. There are certainly projects that, given the nature of the underlying content, don't have that, especially if they're projects like dealing with the very, very distant past, for example. They don't have those community partners. But again, it is in my mind not a coincidence that most of the projects that are funded do have those kind of community partners.
Are letters from community partners able to be written in Spanish? And then somebody else asked, are foreign community partners allowed?
So community partners outside of the US are certainly allowed, especially, if that's the area that your project is sort of engaging with. Unfortunately, at this point, all of the materials submitted have to be in English, just because of the reviewer pool that we recruit and making sure that everyone is able to access all of the materials. And this is across the board for all ACLS programs. We sort of just accept proposals in English at this point.
If you're serving as a co-PI with a tenure line at your home institution on a project with a graduate student co-PI, are there best practices for ensuring that the co-PI receives credit as an equal? How do we ensure that my co-PI's leadership is recognized?
So I can only speak to that with respect to the ways that we amplify and talk about the project once it's selected as a grantee. And so if you'll go on our page, you'll see that all of the project teams, there's a diverse sort of makeup of who is sort of presented. We have folks who are like directly in the community who are listed on our page as part of the principal project teams, graduate students, doctoral fellows who are also listed. And so making sure that that person receives the same kind of visibility as the PI is something that we try very hard to do as well. And then I think we're always happy to strategize and connect you with other project teams around thinking through, how to best make that labor visible of that graduate student. Because again, there are plenty of other projects that have incorporated graduate students as core team members into their work. So also very happy to connect you with folks who have been doing that and to share strategies.
Somebody asked, would it count as a development grant if the project has been tested or started with a different partner? And now a university partner is being brought in to publish digital work? Or would that be a startup since new partners are involved?
I think when I think about the difference again between seed and development, because at each phase of work, you're going to be doing something new, right? But with development, you're building on something that you've already tested or done. And so even if you're incorporating new partners, I would imagine in that case, you're still operating from knowledge or insights that you've learned from a prior phase of the project's sort of lifespan. And so if that is the case and you're building upon that previous knowledge and just use and sort of working with a new community partner to generate new insights, and I still think that that counts as a development project.
Can you apply for both grants?
So you can, but you cannot apply with the same project to both grants. It wouldn't make sense for you to be able to do that if you could. So you can certainly have two different projects and apply within the same year.
Um, for community partner statements of support, would that be just for organizational partners? We are working with local artists and are wondering if we should have them write statements as well.
It can range. I think that if you're working with an organizational partner, obviously, they would be featured pretty significantly in the statement of support. If you're working with discrete individuals, I think you have to sort of consider the role that they're having in your project, because again, there are other elements of this application where you can communicate that those people are working on the project as well. So in the project staffing sort of section of the application, we give you space to talk about who's working on the project, what kind of work they're doing, etc. And so if you are engaging with someone as this is someone who's co-creating the project, they have as much ownership and stake over it as we do. If the project, lives with them rather than at our institution, then those are the folks who would need to submit the statement of community support. So again, thinking about the difference between someone you're bringing in to achieve or do certain tasks related to the project versus someone that is a partner on the project. So making sure that you understand that difference and can use different parts of the application to articulate both of those things.
Can collaborators be undergraduates paid by the project?
Yes.
Okay. Does the PI or co-PI need to be a faculty and or on tenure track? Can it be a PhD candidate who is the main lead on the project?
So as I said, I think earlier in the beginning of the presentation, we don't define scholar in the humanities as someone who has a faculty position or by the specific credential that they have. Um, Increasingly, it is the case that the project teams feature, 2, 3, 4 co-PIs that are spread across different kinds of institutions, have different kinds of positions. And so you can certainly have a PI that is a graduate student. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of that question?
Can it be a, do they need to be on tenure track?
No.
Or, okay. Can you participate as a co-PI in two groups of applicants for the same grant?
Can you participate as a co-PI in could you repeat the
Two
question again?
separate applications for the same grant.
For the same, as long as they are different projects, right? Is that one of the
Yeah,
assumptions
different
built into that
projects.
question?
Right.
Yes.
The PI must be a scholar of humanities, but the program description includes interpretive social sciences. Can you explain a bit more about what qualifies as interpretive social sciences?
Yes. So if you go into the application and on OFA, our online fellowships application, there is a sort of drop down pop up that lists specific kinds of disciplines. So, for example, you could have history of economics, history of law, and I'm giving examples of interpretive social sciences, communications, that sort of thing. But I also want to underscore the importance of using humanistic kinds of methods. So, context setting, critical reading. Empathetic reasoning, these kinds of things that appear in my mind as the bedrock of humanities scholarship, but that also can be incorporated with social science methodologies or more quantitative based methodologies. And so if you have any concern whatsoever as to whether or not you fit within the realm of interpretive social science, because I recognize that, as departments shift and change and things are combined with other things, it's very hard to get a sense of where you fit based off of what your title is or based off of what department you may be housed in. You can always email digital justice and say, um, this is what my work is about. These are the kinds of methods that I typically use. These are the kinds of conversations and other subfields that my work is in conversation with. Am I a good fit? Am I still eligible to apply for this program? And we can certainly talk over email so that you have a clear sense of whether or not you're eligible. So I think we have time for one more question before wrapping up.
Okay, somebody asked, do the reviewers use scoring rubrics similar to NIH reviews? Is it possible to share those scoring items or specific scores with structured feedback so that we can address grant weaknesses more intentionally?
So in last year's competition, we did use a scoring rubric, which was according to the evaluation criteria that's currently listed on the website. And so we asked reviewers to score applications from a a 1, a 0, or a 0.5, depending on the extent to which that application met that evaluation criteria. And again, that criteria is on the website for you to review. And then use those scores as a basis for deliberation, in addition to the written comments that they provided, as well as the comments that emerged out of the very exhaustive deliberation process. Unfortunately, we do not share the scores that folks submit, but we do share the comments that people submit as they're reviewing the questions. And then also, there was a designated note taker in each of the selection committee meetings that took extensive notes on the deliberations themselves. And part of the reason why we don't share the scores is because, again, they function as a useful sort of tool for structuring discussion. But oftentimes, as folks are really digging into an application and discussing it with the other reviewers, their thoughts on an application change. And this is really, in my mind, the beauty of peer review is that someone with very expertise in a different area can provide additional insight that perhaps another reviewer didn't have. And so they change their scores in real time. And because of that, I don't think that the numerical scores actually reflect where reviewers ultimately end up with respect to how they evaluate an application. And so I find that the qualitative comments that they provide are actually much more useful. And so we have done a lot of work in terms of trying to, when we package those comments to pass on to applicants, to categorize them based off of strengths. These are the things that the reviewers really enjoyed about this application and want to encourage you to pursue more of. And then another section called strategies for revision, which offers some concrete, constructive pieces of feedback that you can consider as you think about either reapplying to this program or applying to other programs. So again, we have tried our hardest to make sure that everyone gets that piece of feedback. Sometimes it's not the case that we don't have, sometimes it's the case that we don't have comments for specific applications. But again, I think that sort of sharing the scores gives a little bit of a misleading picture around what an application looks like according to the reviewers, in a way that the comments provide a more holistic picture. So we will continue to do that work, especially with the first round of review, making sure that people get those comments and in that structure. And then for the second round of review, again, making sure that people get those comments and in that particular structure. So it is 2:55. I'm going to pause here in terms of asking any more questions. Again, if you have questions about your specific application, please email digitaljustice@acls.org. Unfortunately, because of capacity, we don't offer individual Zoom consultations with prospective applicants. But if you want some more live, so to speak, FaceTime, you can always attend one of the office hours to actually have a conversation. But otherwise, you can certainly feel free to email us. The last thing that I want to sort of go over is the fact, I'm sorry, let me pull this up. There you go. So again, you can email digitaljustice@acls.org if you have additional questions. I want to thank everyone who attended today and asked their questions, which I hope work towards the benefit of the group. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, so you're able to reference it or send it to colleagues who might have missed the session. The slides also will be posted to the Digital Justice Program page, and we'll send a follow-up email directing you to that early next week. Before you go, I do want to ask a small favor. I'm a firm believer in the value of revision, not just for writing or for developing projects, but also for programs like this. And it's one of the primary ethos of digital justice's larger unit idea to approach our work iteratively. We're trying our hardest to sort of work towards that aspirational vision of justice, but we inevitably will get some things wrong. And we also know that some of the things that we want to change, like, we have a long runway to doing so because they take a lot of work. But we rely on the candid feedback of our constituencies to direct that iterative process. And so I want to ask my colleague Katie to post in a chat a link to a post-webinar survey. It's very, very short, just 5 questions that hopefully give us a sense of how useful these sessions are to you. So the survey asks you to consider whether or not you'd be open to being contacted about participating in a focus group in the summer once the competition is over. And during that group, we sort of talk about your experiences navigating the competition, talk about your thoughts on the application structure. And again, as you have heard earlier, we very much take that feedback seriously, and it does go into changing certain aspects of the program. So this answer doesn't lock you into participating. It simply gives us a starting point for doing outreach once we do the work of inviting folks to that focus group. So once again, I want to thank you for your time. Best of luck on your application. And if you have any questions, concerns, comments, please send them to digitaljustice@acls.org. All right, take care, everyone.